How did you know when your movie was done?
When Stevie Wonder finally answered my phone call.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the THR Roundtables. I'm Rebecca Keegan, and really delighted to have you all here to talk about documentaries. I would just like to go around and introduce everybody. Jonas Poher Rasmussen with Flea, Liz Garbus with Becoming Cousteau, Amir Questlove Thompson with Summer of Soul, Todd Haynes with The Velvet Underground, Betsy West with My Name is Polly Murray, and Julia, Robert Greene with Procession, and Jimmy Chin with The Rescue. Thanks for being here, guys. I thought we'd dive in by talking a little bit about the idea of documentaries. Liz, I learned that Jacques Cousteau did not like the word. He wanted his movies called adventure films. Do documentaries need a rebrand? Are they officially cool now? What do you think?
I think documentaries are officially cool, Rebecca.
Yes.
No, it's funny because I've been doing this for a while, and I remember an early Sundance that I went to when people, they're writing, oh, the documentaries are the best thing at Sundance, and then they kind of kept saying that year after year, and noticing that there was all this incredible work happening in this field as if it was some revelation anew. I think we finally kind of caught up to that, where there's a real appetite and audience for docs. They're getting the support that they need. I think for Cousteau, he rejected the word documentary because he defined documentary as a person who thinks they know more than you, giving you a lecture. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look around this table, that is not quite how we've all been using the form. Mm-hmm. So perhaps today, in this collegial field, he would appreciate being called a documentarian.
It used to be the D word, right? Documentary, you would avoid that word at all costs, and I think you're right. I mean, it really is cooler, and because documentaries have learned so much from narrative filmmakers like you and others, and I think that's part of the difference.
We also have to remind ourselves, the form has been vital and alive and challenging the boundaries of what we think documentaries are from the beginning. It's really cool.
All the best films, in the history of cinema, sort of talk to each other in that way. Like the best fiction films have elements of documentary that it's taking me on a journey. I think that that D word idea has been dead for a really long time, actually. But there's still that sort of fictional, almost straw man argument of documentaries are supposed to, but no one actually thinks that, and especially the film.
Actually did.
But yeah,
but it was the 1960s.
Well, he's a busy man. He's doing.
Back then they were lecturing at you. There was a kind of voice of God.
They weren't. I mean, a lot of these films
Some
Todd's
were.
mentioned.
Some of them were.
Right.
Amir, I've heard you call yourself a reluctant leader in your music career.
Yes.
Does that apply to you as a filmmaker as well? Do you think of yourself as a reluctant leader?
I will probably say after completing this film, then I've accepted that, okay, I have to be a leader. Because I think oftentimes, because I come from a culture that only celebrates youth, no one's really rushing to become the old wise sage, There was a point where, younger rappers started calling me OG, and I was just like, wait, dog, I'm not even a G.
I do not accept O or G.
Yeah, exactly. And I know, for them, it's like their version of you're a griot or whatever, but I don't know. I think that for me personally, taking on this film was more of a personal challenge for me in my life, because I tried to duck it the second that Robert and David approached me about this film. First I was defensive, oh, it never happened, and then I was super defensive, well, why do you want me to do it? And but inherently I knew deep down inside that my level of nerdom, the abyss level of deep rabbit holes that I can dive into with music films, or just with music period, my passion for it, that I should be the one to tell this story. And so But this also just taught me a lot about being a leader, like communicating with people. And I come from a place where I'll joke for days that you sang a bad note, or what kind of solo was that? Where you can't do that to your photographer, your boom, like you can't. So it's just a whole nother world of communication. So I'll say that this is actually teaching me to be a better human being and a leader. Yeah.
Well, what does leadership look like on a documentary set? Jimmy, what does it look like for you?
One of them is probably just staying calm in the chaos, because there are so many challenges. Every film has, different challenges. And I think oftentimes they feel really impossible to overcome. But I found that if you look at these challenges as opportunities and challenges as ways to become more creative in how you kind of overcome them, like it's the creative problem-solving process, I think, that everybody here shares. And being able to take a lead in kind of approaching it that way is a big deal for, I think, all of us. I think we've all been in that position. How are we going to fix this? How are we going to get that footage? And a lot of it is just persistence, dogged persistence.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So, okay, in the documentary world, like I know for scripted film, I noticed the relationship between the director and the assistant director, sort of like good cop, bad cop, and usually the bad cop is right. Usually is never the director. You know, it's the one that barks the orders and yells and whatnot. But in the documentary world, where you kind of have to go in real time and pivot. How do you? I would imagine that you would have to take both roles, because it's like what story you want to tell, but especially for your film, there's also a life-risking factor to it as well. So how do you wrestle with yourself in terms of like, all right, do I push a little bit further to see if we can investigate?
Yeah.
How is
No, for sure. I mean, first of all, like resources within documentary filmmaking, you don't necessarily get an AD. You're actually
right, exactly.
You're actually producing, directing.
Yeah, you're everything. You're the good
you're
cop and the bad
everything.
cop. Right.
But I think when the stakes are really high on a shoot and there's potentially a lot of risk, that's a really interesting place to be, because you're also responsible for the safety of your crew. And you're really evaluating, the different levels of risk. What is everybody willing to take? I think establishing a baseline of like everybody understanding what the risk threshold everybody's willing to take before you go into the shoot is hugely important. That's part about being a good leader and communicating that, and having your team be able to communicate with you if they don't feel like it's a safe environment. But it's also about building the team that you feel like is on the same level with you. But yeah, those questions are things that I feel like on a lot of the projects I've worked on are at the forefront of my mind.
I think that's a really interesting question. I'm sorry. For Robert's film, because in terms of risk of the sort of emotional stability of those subjects, and how and you're engaging in a process in real time, over time, that you're documenting, but you're pushing into really treacherous places in people's histories and private lives, personal lives. I'm just wondering how that element of risk and navigation of risk played into your experience.
Well, so Procession is about these 6 guys who are all survivors. They've been abused as children by Catholic priests, and we work with them, and they create scenes and sort of come together as a brotherhood, a family. And we could not have made this film. Like, this is my 7th feature documentary. This is not a film that we could have made, me and the whole team, because actually part of the answer to your question, I think, is building a team, right? Like, I have 3 producers, Doug, Sue, and Bennett, who are amazing, and Rob Kolodny, who's the DP. We've worked together for a really long time. You know what that's like to have like deep collaborations. And for us, it was really just kind of thinking of it as like building the sandbox There's therapists sort of that are on the walls. There's these boundaries that we've sort of created. And the guys were so ready to take this step. And we knew that instantly. So the film was cast by a lawyer, Rebecca Randalls, who had been working with the guys for many years. And that's the first safety check, right? The first risk assessment is her saying, these guys can do it and should do it, which is two huge questions. And then from that point, we knew we were working within a sort of trust zone, right? One of the things about this kind of abuse and the legal system, it sort of forces silence and shame upon the people who were abused. And the moment, this is not a revolutionary thing, it's like this is what AA is based on. Like, you're in the same room with other people who have a shared experience, and instantly you feel a little bit better. And that's how we sort of move forward. And then eventually, maybe a third of the way through the process, they start grabbing the bull by the horns and start saying, okay, well, I'd like to do this. You know, what if we could do this? And then I usually go to my producers and say, look, I know we don't have the money yet, but we got to go to Wyoming, or we got to go do this, and then they start seeing that they're actually in control. That's the most powerful thing. The fear of re-traumatization is such a real thing, but here's the trick. You cannot re-traumatize when you give power, because trauma comes from taking power away. And if you give people power and the agency to make their own choices and to make the decisions, then it's not really possible, especially, and I don't know how I feel about not possible, but especially with this kind of abuse. You know, Michael from the film, he said the other day, I'm re-traumatized by a smell. I'm not re-traumatized when you say, hey, let's make something and try to help other people, you know. So that's kind of what we were balancing the whole time.
It made me think of your film, Jonas, because you're also dealing with a really vulnerable subject. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of lead character in Flea and how you navigated his emotions?
So the difference between our projects is that I knew my subject since I was 15 years old and had this curiosity about his past for more than 25 years. So it was a very fragile situation because we were friends as well. So there's a huge responsibility for me as a filmmaker, but also as a friend to tell his story right. Mm-hmm. So we kind of agreed on in the beginning that we were just trying things out, you know. I tried to record this first time that he would share his story, and he would always have the possibility to say, okay, but this is not working for me. I can't do this anyway. So for the first year or so, we were just trying things out. And he always had a space where he could say, okay, I'm not ready to talk more today, or we can't do this film at all. Just to kind of, that he's got a sense of, can this be done?
There's a doorway,
yeah.
we can leave. Yeah.
Can this be done? And then slowly, of course, when money came into the project, I kind of had to know if we were actually going to do it. At some point, we kind of look at each other in the eye and say, okay, are you okay doing this? And he was like, yes, I'm ready. But also, you know, it was a very symbiotic approach because he felt like he needed to share his story. He had carried it around for so long, and I was curious about his story for so long. So the process of him telling the story and me hearing it for the first time and making it into a film was very symbiotic. But it was super important for me from the very beginning to make a safe space where he felt like, this is my room, I have control, I can always walk out if I need to. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Todd, with your background, presumably you could have made The Velvet Underground as a narrative movie. Why did you choose the form of documentaries?
The project was sort of presented to me, offered to me as a documentary from David Blackman at Universal Music Group after having spoken to Laurie Anderson, who was turning over Lou Reed's archive to the New York City Public Library. And David works in the film video division of Universal Music Group, Polygram. And he approached my producer, Christine, and said, do you think Todd would be interested in doing a doc on the Velvets? And I'd never done a documentary. I've loved documentaries. They've informed my own filmmaking, but there was no question that I wanted to try to jump into this new crazy world, knowing though, and I think this was in fact part of the attraction and the excitement, is that this band doesn't exist in any of the places that most subjects of a rock documentary would in terms of live concert footage or promotional footage or anything like that, that it was going to be about diving into the avant-garde filmmaking of the 1960s, and the Velvet Underground are most associated with Andy Warhol's cinema. But they had, because this time and place was so defined by this very rich and complicated interaction among artists and filmmakers, they had relationships with many other avant-garde filmmakers. And cinema was part of the world that they entered into as a band. In fact, they were sort of the house band for Jonas Mekas' film series at the Cinematheque before they were even called the Velvet Underground. They sort of found their body and soul or something in this very unique climate. So it was an invitation to try to use that material, because it's always about how do you visualize the music, how do you visualize the time and place. I didn't have what Muir had in this unbelievable footage and this lost history, you know. That was just such a revelatory thing to discover, I would think.
It's actually really fun to think about the four of your films as, like, I mean, Julia, master of television form, you know, the Velvet's and you know, experimental film, and then obviously I just think about Nina Simone coming on stage at the end, just like, oh my God, and then obviously being a filmmaker. So it's like you're making archival films with subject matter where the people are such great storytellers in the footage itself, which is kind of phenomenal, you know.
But I actually think it's almost equally a curse to have too much information because,
Yeah.
you know,
How did you choose?
I always say that, as a cereal expert, like, I could survive off of peanut butter Captain Crunch till I die, but I mean, realistically, after my fourth bowl, I'm like, I had enough. And, you know, looking at 40 hours of footage, because I didn't want to leave any stone unturned or that sort of thing. It was almost, I think we used less than 15% of the footage. So it's a matter of looking for that needle in the haystack. So I almost imagine that having little to no information and having way too much information could almost be equal.
I think we had 500 hours from the Cousteau archive. And I mean, it was crazy. And the one really interesting thing, thinking about all, you know, like as filmmakers and archives and how you deal with it, is one conversation I had with his second wife, who was controlling the estate, where she said something like, at first they gave us only outtakes. And we were sort of like, but we need to be able to reference the films too. And she said to me on this Zoom, she said, well, Liz, I mean, if somebody was making a film about you and your work, and, you know, they just put your films in it, how would you feel? And I'd be like, I would feel great. Like, and it was just sort of like, and in fact, if they were using my outtakes, I'd be a little like, you know, like, yeah.
Don't you hate the question? Do you get the question a lot? What did you leave out of your film?
Oh my God, everything!
All the time. What did you leave out of your film?
I always get asked
that. I left
that.
it out because it didn't work, you know, and I forgot about it. I'm trying to forget about what we left out of the film.
I think it's like if you've walked into a potter's studio and there's just clay all over, and you walk out with one little vase.
Right.
There's a lot of clay left in that studio, and it's like, sort of, people can understand, like, you're finding a shape, and it's your shape, it's your vase. You would make this, you know, you all would make your Jacques Cousteau film, out of those 500 hours, you would pick a different vase. And I think, like, all of us, and that's point of view, and then sometimes, you know, when audience members sort of say, but this is the true story, it's like, it's a story. You know, it's a story, and it's the one that I found amongst all that clay. But you're leaving a lot there, and it's totally yours, right? And everybody could come out with a very different looking vase. Okay, and I'll stop with that terrible metaphor.
No, but I
love you said vase, which shows me how you make more than $100,000 a year.
The base.
No, but you know, and the other thing that we're dealing with is subjects who are no longer here, which is different than having to have a therapist on set to deal with this. And that's a different kind of responsibility because you're really trying to do justice to their stories. You know, in our case, you know, a woman who very well known, Julia Child, and a person not so well known, Pauli Murray, who was just an extraordinary, innovative activist and lawyer who had a profound impact on our world, and people don't know Pauli Murray's name. And so I think when you talk about leadership, I feel like it's really important, I mean, and it was for both these stories, to have a lot of input from your team. I mean, it's a collaborative medium, you know, and you might have a vision, and my directing partner, Julie Cohen, and I do discuss what we're going to do, but it's not like having a script, like a narrative script, where you just follow the script. You know, things happen.
Well, things also happen when you're following the script too. Hopefully,
they also they do happen, but in the way with a documentary that you really have to go with the finds that you make in the archive. And we also, you know, with Julia had just a tremendous amount of archive, and it turned out Pauli Murray had saved 141 boxes that are in the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, because Pauli kind of had a sense that even though not recognized in their time, would be later on.
For those of you whose films are predominantly archival, is there a moment where you found something and you said, this is my movie? I mean, just something that you were delighted by. What was it?
Well, we had an amazing moment. Well, with Pauli Murray, Pauli had become an Episcopal priest, the first female identified African-American Episcopal priest. So a number of people had interviewed Pauli. So there are 40 hours of that, which was pretty cool. And then my partner Julie was at the library and basically stumbled on a video that had not been digitized. And when we digitized this video, it was pretty amazing, and that's what we opened the film with. It's a shot of Pauli Murray with the priest collar on, with the amazing smile, and then, you know, the quality is crummy, and, you know, you see all the hash, and then Pauli is reprimanding the dog because they're getting ready for the interview, and kids going, get down, and typing away, and it just, when we saw it, we thought, oh, that's who Pauli is. You know, the smile and the warmth. That was when we thought, okay, we can really do this.
I'll say that for my film, it's pretty much like Jeopardy. Like, you got all the answers, and we had to figure out what the questions were, because all we had were the performances, and in trying to chisel away. What our story narrative was. There's an interesting moment between Stevie Wonder and his musical director, Gene Key. I left this as an Easter egg right after the credits end, because the way that Motown was with entertainment, you had to do everything. So it's like, it's post-vaudeville, there's a little Abbott and Costello comedy moment between the two. Like, I mean, there's moments in 60s shows, especially with soul shows, where, you know, like Maceo Parker had to do stand-up comedy for James Brown in the middle of the show, like the night that Martin Luther King died. That's the weird thing. So it's like, it's that whole Showtime vaudeville thing that's still happening. And so there's a moment where Gene Key ribs Stevie Wonder. Gene Key is sort of like he would be a David Seville to Stevie Wonder's Alvin. Alvin the Chip, like Stevie's 19, rambunctious. He wants to play drums one moment, keyboards the next moment, and jump all over the place. And
this is the dad from Alvin and the Chipmunks?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, just checking.
Right. Wait, I never once thought of Dave Seville as their dad.
Okay, well, that's another
Procreated
question.
to have
The guardian figure.
I thought you said manager.
Okay.
Wait,
This is why I'm clarifying.
This is how my mind works now. Now I'm going to be thinking about, wait, how do they come on this earth?
There are many kinds of families.
Sorry, I steered you way off. All
right, he's a cat dad with chipmunks, okay. Anyway, so there's a point where Gene tells Stevie, like, man, you up here in Harlem singing all these love songs, but meanwhile, like, man's on the moon right now. It's the day of the moon landing, and he's kind of ribbing Stevie for, like, you're just in Harlem singing love songs. Meanwhile, like, man's making history. And, you know, if it weren't for our fourth camera, like, even though they were doing this whole playful bad guy, good guy thing, even the audience was in on the joke. But when Gene said that, the audience instantly booed. And I was like, wait, did black people have did we have disdain for the moon landing that I don't know about? Because I grew up in a time period in which, you know, second grade in like 1978, 79, like they're bringing in like Tang and this is Neil Armstrong and, you know, you too can be an astronaut and all these things. So the narrative that I got in school was like, this is a great thing. And we wanted to look under the hood because we wanted to find other stories connected to this concert that weren't exactly there. So when we were looking for like black people's reactions to the moon landing, we accidentally, CBS News Archives gave us all this footage. Now the way that they work is that if it never aired, they won't clear it. And so we didn't know this, so of course there's this this crazy sequence in which you have black people responding to the same way, like, look, there's poverty here on Earth and we still da-da-da-da-da, like, that's a waste of money as far as we're concerned. And when we went to clear it, CBS was just like, oh no, we can't clear that because, and we're like, wait, you're the only documented source of this response, we need it. And it was back and forth, like it was one of the hardest things, more than like clearing Beatles songs or covers or that sort of thing. And yeah, I just had to level, like, look, like black erasure is such a major component to this story. I know you have to follow the rules, but you need to understand that I'm telling the story of black erasure. And for you to just say that, well, because it didn't air, then I can't let you have this footage. I was, you know, history demands that you show this footage, so like at the last minute, maybe just to get us off their case. Wow. They did that, but we weren't supposed to have that footage at all.
That's such a great story. As underlying what documentary is, it's the moment where you're like, wait a second, there's this thing over there that is in the footage that I didn't know,
right.
No one else really talks about. And then that becomes a story.
Takes you down
Yeah.
the
Every
road.
time somebody starts a story,
I
it's like,
know.
and then they sent us this box, and you're like,
Right.
and then there was this box,
Yeah.
and you're like, what? What's in the box?
I think a lot of my sensitivity with, like, in the beginning of not wanting the responsibility of telling the story, because in my heart I knew this was much more than just me putting the right 17 songs together. Like, I felt like, okay, oftentimes when black history is told, it's often incorrect or revisionized or whatever, and this is like, okay, Amir, this is your one moment to hit this grand slam out the park, and don't you mess it up, Amir, don't you mess, and you know, and I'm the person that's always in my head, like, you know, I'll manifest, or the way, oh God, I'm about to get TMI. My therapist says man a fuck. You know, I'm about to man a fuck a moment. And for me, I don't know, like when we got that first rejection letter and the second and the third and the fourth, like you know, it's just, we were insistent that this has to be included, so.
Yeah.
Jimmy, yeah, you had a
process
look
is
of
just-
recognition as he was talking.
Yeah, because I think that process of like absolute persistence, when you feel responsible for the story that you're telling, is just, you know, we all put so much pressure on ourselves. And for us in the rescue, you know, we'd only heard rumor about this footage that the Thai Navy SEALs had. And even though there was all this global media coverage, which was its own kind of archival nightmare, because we had to go around the world and try to figure out, you know, BBC, CNN, all these different entities that had covered it, down to local Thai, you know, news stations, to people's iPhones that were there. That was its own archival nightmare. But the Thai Navy SEALs, we knew had this like critical footage inside the cave, and there wasn't hardly any footage from inside the cave because no civilians were allowed to film in the cave. And we negotiated for 2 years. You know, it's like all these 4 a.m. calls with the admiral of the Thai Navy SEALs, and the Thai Navy SEALs, they run covert operations. You know, they definitely don't publicize.
I was wondering why, I was obsessed with why the faces were blurred out.
And
Okay,
so,
I get it.
And the faces are blurred on a lot of the participants because they're active duty special ops, you know, operators. And so they just would not give us the footage. But because we knew it existed and because we're crazy documentary filmmakers, we were like, we have to get that footage because that perspective is so important, you know, and part of the story is just that it's fragmented, but it had so many different perspectives, people from different countries and cultures and backgrounds coming together to achieve this impossible thing, but yet, you know, we needed to put all that together, and their part of the contribution to the rescue was so critical, and it really wasn't until Chai, you know, got her second vaccination, flew to Thailand, did her 2-week you know, quarantine, and literally went to the Thai admiral's house and like knocked on the door and was like, made her case. And I still don't know what she said to them because I was 100% convinced. I was like, there's no way they're gonna give us this footage. And they didn't actually give it to her. They sent a delegation of Thai Navy SEALs with the hard drives in a briefcase. I don't know if it was actually handcuffed to them, but that's how I imagine it. And they showed up at our studios and they sat with us to make sure that we blurred the right faces and just the, you know, this is a governmental, you know, agency that works with, you know, military for a foreign government. You know, it was very complicated and political, but that's, you know, part of, you know, making a film, and that footage is just so critical.
Well, you brought up something earlier that I was curious about. I know in your particular case, the Navy SEALs had the footage that you were trying to get, but if you're ever in a situation where, like, do all of us have to deal with, I'd rather apologize than ask permission in terms of telling a story?
I've heard that before.
What'd you say?
Not with Navy SEALs.
I was going to say not with the Thai Navy SEAls.
Okay.
I might not
yes,
be
I
here.
think.
Okay.
But I do agree with that philosophy in
Yeah.
general, especially when they're holding something back that has like major historical import. Like, you know, like what would you do if they'd said, no, you had the screeners, you know, I mean, your insurance
Yeah,
company would
I
have had
was-
some problems. But like, it is, yeah, seek forgiveness.
I think the big thing is like, we're going back to the original impulse of all this discussion in here is like news journalism versus documentary filmmaking. That's the conversation that we're having. And it's amazing when you're talking about that CBS, what an amazing thing to say. If it didn't air, you're not allowed to use it. So they're saying that if they didn't, you know, monetize it, then therefore it is erased, which is phenomenal. And one of the things I love about The Rescue is just the idea that you worked so hard to get this footage, but the film works because you're going where footage can't go by recreating these moments, these emotional moments that literally we wouldn't have known about had you not created these incredibly, you know, powerful scenes that are like give us the feeling of what it feels like to actually do it. So the footage is so important, but there's a limitation to the footage as well. You know, like there is no, like in our film, the staging these moments, some of these moments that the guys stage are like pivotal moments in their lives. And it's not about it's not about the reality of what happened. It's about the psychological space of what happened. We've heard countless news stories about, you know, children being abused by priests. This is not a new thing. It's so devastatingly not a new thing, but no one can quite talk about it right, you know? No one can know the news stories, the sort of footage that is allowed, like the CBS story here, is like that footage or that story or however you want to frame it, the allowed version is totally inadequate for what the experience of being abused in this way is and what it means to grow up in this way and what it means to try to conquer that in some ways. And so that's what I think there's some version of that for all these films. It's like, I want to discover a method to move things forward. And I think we're all sort of thinking about that, like finding that footage, or just the idea of being like, it's amazing. Like you could have said, "Oh, it's too precious that this footage is so amazing," you know. But no, you're like, no. The emotional space that we have to be in underwater, and we need to feel what it feels like that changes the movie.
Well, that was a huge part about this story, was that there was this global media coverage, so everybody thinks they know what happened,
right.
But in
fact, everyone thinks they know what happened. That is like, that could be the underlying.
I know, that
thing
is the
about your
underlying,
film.
because that's the thing, is like, but it's all superficial. You're like, oh yeah, and the divers said this, they're like, I think we made it look too easy, because as far as the rest of the world knew, we went into the cave.
That's so powerful.
And then we came out with the kids. But for us, the story was so much around the moral courage of these divers and really the generosity of all the volunteers. But you know, people don't understand the decisions they had to make because, you know, they're amateur divers. They're not paid rescue teams like the top rescue teams in the world are the American PJ from the Air Force and the Thai Navy SEALs, but the accountability of this outrageous plan landed on their shoulders, and essentially, you know, they had to go in and enact this rescue when they basically had everything to lose. Because if it had gone wrong, the global scrutiny, their reputations would have been, their lives are over, and they still decided.
Lives over.
But if we couldn't illustrate what they were actually doing and like how outrageously difficult it was, like what it looks like to try to move an anesthetized child underwater, you know, through this labyrinthian cave, like the gravity of what they were dealing with is completely lost, right? Because people are like, oh, they went in the cave and they came out with the kids. Great job, you know.
Well, Jonas, you had kind of a similar twist on the problem in that you used animation in order to show things that you couldn't get to with the camera. How did you come to that decision and how did it work?
But it was kind of the only way to do it, actually, because, you know, first of all, he really wanted to be anonymous. This is the first time he shares the story. In the film, you hear his real voice telling the story for the very first time. And it's not easy for him to talk about. So the fact that being public about it and meeting people in the street who wanted to, you know, small talk about his experiences and his traumas, that we couldn't do that. And also because the film takes place in the past. So it was really about how to kind of revitalize, you know, his childhood home in Afghanistan, what did Afghanistan look like in the 80s, and placing him there. But also because it's really a story about memory and trauma, and with the animation, it really enables us to be more expressive and go more into his emotion. So at times when he has a hard time remembering something, or it's difficult for him to talk about a trauma, you could really sense it in his voice, how he starts to talk. And I really wanted to show that in the visual side as well. And with the animation, we could be more, you know, emotional and surreal and dreamlike, and really be honest to his inner emotion more so than trying to be realistic to what happened. There's a sequence in the film where his sisters is in a container trying to flee to Sweden, and he wasn't there, so he wouldn't know what it would be like, but his fear was there. So trying to show that instead with the animation. So really, animation, when that idea came up, it was the only way to tell a story.
When did music enter the process, even if it was temp music? Because I find the score to be such an important part of the experience.
It's incredible.
It's so beautiful.
But it was really from the get-go. I have a background in radio, so I actually first did like a rough cut of the film as a radio documentary.
An audio cut.
An audio cut, yeah. So they're already there. I put in the music, temp music, from the composer I wanted on. And also there's a lot of, you know, pop cultural references in the film as well. You have Aha and Daft Punk and Roxette and everything. Yeah. And so I had that in there. So we had to struggle. Like, my persistence wasn't getting to the Navy SEALs, it was getting to Daft Punk.
Clearances. Oh boy.
And it wasn't as dramatic, but it was, you know, I think I spent like 3 years on getting to Daft Punk, and it was so intense. At the end, my producer said, you have 2 weeks to get to Daft Punk, otherwise we need to find something else. So I had people kind of knocking on doors in Los Angeles. I just started spamming their management, and a week before I finally got a letter that they had seen the clip and they loved it, and we could get it for no money. It was.
We had
when the plan comes together.
We had a similar thing with our Julia film because we fell in love with the particular Jimi Hendrix song that we used in the beginning, and we kind of couldn't imagine the opening without that song. So you know, we understood that the Hendrix estate was sometimes reluctant to give permission, and finally they said, "Oh, okay, let's see what you have: Julia Child, Jimi Hendrix.
Marriage made in heaven.
Yeah, I mean, it's a match made in heaven, and you know, I don't know what they thought when they saw it, but then we did get permission. I was so relieved because I just couldn't imagine what we were going to do.
How did you do it?
Jimi Hendrix is cool. His
Yeah,
little sister is
Jamie-
she's very cool.
I think
Yeah.
she got a kick out of
Yeah,
seeing
like the
it,
irony
you know,
of it
like
all.
the
Yeah.
irony of it all, and you know, and then we also had Rachel Portman doing the actual score, which was a different experience from what on the Pauline Murray film where we had Jeannick Bontemps, who's amazing, but was really involved from the very beginning and working with our editor and with us, because Pauline Murray's story, so many ups and downs, so many challenges, and yet, you know, kept coming back and kept having moments of joy, so the transitions were hard. So he was really involved from the beginning. Rachel Portman works in a different way. Rachel basically talked about the film at the beginning and then used some temp music, but delivered to her. And we had this amazing session where she went through every single cue and just said, okay, what was the emotion you're going for here? What is it? What is it? And we were like naming words, you know, we were going adventure, you know, creative, mad at the parents, whatever it was. We're just, you know, we're yelling out words. It went on for about 3 hours, and then, you know, some weeks later came back with this extraordinary score. So it was like very different experience.
Man, for me, it was from the gate, it was like absolutely positively no Beatles covers. And who knew that in 1969 at a soul festival in Harlem, there would be 17 Beatles covers? Who knew? So, yeah.
Is there not one Beatle cover in the film?
Man, there were so many great versions of Yesterday, like just between. Well, because back then, like until the arrival of Sgt. Pepper's, like the idea of like a complete album body of work wasn't a thing. So back then, you just had your 3 hits.
Right.
The covers, the 4 covers that the rest of the world knows. Oh, Beatles, and then you know. So like Motown,
yesterday always worked.
yeah.
It always worked.
Like literally, yeah, Motown and Beatles covers. That could be a box set on its own. So, yeah, for me that was also a learning experience, because my life at the Tonight Show, I know what crimes I can get away with musically. Like all the time, we'll taunt the Led Zeppelin estate by just playing like just 5 seconds of a song. You know, we're world famous for like those types of pranks, but here, like learning like the rates of each estate, and you know, you could only get 1 minute and 19 seconds of a song in, and you know, the music historian of me wants to have the whole song sort of out there, you know, just as iconic, but then like also the hip hop head in me knows that at the 3-minute mark, there's a really good drum break that I know all my producer friends are like, why don't you play the drum break? So it was a lot of sweetening that I had to do editing wise to sort of like serve my inner hip hop head and my music historian, and also make sure that I stayed within that 1 minute and 19 second rule before rates doubled. So yeah, music clearance alone was an education for this film.
How was your movie changed by COVID?
Oh my God.
How did all your movies get changed by COVID?
Yeah, I mean, you know.
Some of us have 2 movies.
You know, it was obvious. We were very lucky that for both the films we were working on, we had done the majority of the shooting before the lockdown hit.
One of the biggest challenges for us was just all the interviews we had to do with people who are like all over the world, right? Australia and Thailand and the UK. So it was just this exhaustive process of kind of building that rapport on Zoom, which is just a lot harder than meeting them in person, you know.
We were lucky. We shot all the interviews for Velvet Underground in 2018. We started with Jonas, who had just turned 97 years old, and we were like, we have to get Jonas on film. It became his last filmed interview before he passed away.
So imagine you're working with these 6 guys and they have been denied justice. And we've all this momentum. Literally, we shot most of the stuff in January. We've been working for years to get to this point, and then it just gets shut down. And it's like, okay, well, we'll talk about it in a couple weeks. And then, I mean, that's
Remember
the
that?
other.
Yeah, we're going to be back in a few
couple
weeks.
weeks, couple months. We can schedule for the summer. We could, and then it just keeps getting pushed. So for the guys, it was excruciating. And then so for them to actually be able to go to Telluride, the premiere, and all this stuff, to actually pay that off was terrifyingly out of grasp for such, because I just didn't want to be yet another thing that they were set up for that didn't come through.
Imagine not only having to deal with the COVID issues, but also in the middle of like the biggest civil unrest that this country has seen in like 50 years. This totally 100% changed the narrative of the film. Even though we'd spent 2 years on pre-production, I would consider March 15th, 2020 as like the real starting date. Like the pre-starting date, I got a few people. I got like Merlin McCoo, Billy Davis Jr., and like some of our key principal people for the film. But we were like saving up our big guns for March 15th, 2020, like marking off on the calendar. We get everything ready, ducks in a row, ducks in a row. That was
your date?
Right, and then it came, and then I went back to that. I went back to the beginning where I just squished myself and like, see, this is the universe telling you you shouldn't be directing this film, and it's over. And I was just like, okay, we're shutting down, because on March 15th, when everything got real and everything was shut down, you know, I was thinking more about like, okay, it takes 2 hours we found a Trader Joe's in Connecticut that we can drive to, that the line's only 2 hours to get food. Like, we just thought the apocalypse was happening. And so, you know, thank God for my production partner, Joseph Patel, who like really like honed in on me, like, no, this is still our we have to stay on the path. And I was like, but we lost Harry Belafonte, and we lost the Chambers brothers, and we lost like 7 people. And thank God for Zoom. Like, Zoom came into our lives like 3 days later, and we figured out, okay, so we'll just scale down to like maybe a 5-man operation. And, you know, you have to find out people's comfort level, and everyone's like, I'm quarantining on a farm, and we didn't know what was happening. And I don't know. And then it really got turned up a notch once Black Lives Matter protests started happening in the streets. And you know, then the irony wasn't lost on me. Like, wait a minute, exactly what we're dealing with in 1969 is happening 50 years later. And then it was like, well, okay, is it amateur hour for us to go down there with footage? Does anyone feel comfortable? Da-da-da-da-da. Like, it was so much, like, this was too much history. Like, I was already handed a boulder of history to take, you know, but then it's like, well, we're kind of living in history right now. Like, I know 50 years from now, people are going to look at 2020 the same way that I look at the civil rights period. Whew, that was just such a doozy to deal with. But I will say that, you know, now that the smoke is cleared, like, there's absolutely no way I would have wound up with the product I wound up with if it weren't for what we went through in 2020, which is really hard for me to accept, like, you know, to the detriment. Because on the other hand, you know, so many of my friends died, and, you know, so I'm also dealing with like funeral arrangements and families and all the other stuff. And it was such a learning process, like, in trauma and just humanity, like, getting through 2020. And the fact that I wound up with this thing, it's still mind-blowing to me.
We've been through something, a real trial, and that's why the 60s were being brought up a lot in the years even before COVID, in the Trump era. I mean, but absolutely by George Floyd demonstrations, and by what was happening on the streets. And And I think that sense of being isolated, forced into isolation as a culture, galvanized the need to get out on the streets around an event that brought the culture back together.
Well, I reluctantly have to wind us down. This is a fascinating conversation. I could listen to you guys talk all day. So I have one last question for you, which is, how did you know when your movie was done?
When Stevie Wonder finally answered my phone call.
That's exactly what happened to me.
When Stevie Wonder. Yeah.
I know, nobody can answer now.
No, I think the end of the process. It's like it's a feeling. Every film I've ever made, there's that feeling. It's like, okay, we're done filming now, and you could just see. It's like whatever the need to do this from my side as a filmmaker and from the participant's side on the other side of the camera. That need has that scratch has been, or itch has been scratched. I always get those scratch. But in the same sense, I think everyone would say this: the film's never over. You know,
You're always tweaking.
Soderbergh,
Yeah.
they're never finished, they're just abandoned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the fact that it's both like for sure, and then it's infinite at the same time.
I don't know if it's ever done, because I'll admit that. Okay, so in the music world, Kanye West sort of set a precedent where even if it's released product, you can change verses. So when his Pablo album came out, I have like 6 different versions of it. And when I go on Spotify, I'm like, wait a minute, I don't remember this verse going on. And I'll look, text, and be like, oh, you did change your verse. Like, so even for us, I'll say that we discovered, I believe right after Sundance, there was a shot, a picture that we discovered that somehow we had missed of a father and son at the festival that was really, really touching. Like the second you saw it, I was like, yo, how come we didn't use this? And you know, I know like the rule is like once you do final lock, that's it. And it's like, well, this, but then I thought like, was it morally wrong like to switch this last photo because like, you know, we already got Sundance, so should this be the film that people see? And then I just went back to the Kanye West thing, like, no, everything is changeable. So at the last minute, nobody was looking, and we locked it and we added it in. But for me, I came to the table with a 3-hour and 25-minute film. So the hardest part was taking away 90 minutes. So when we got it down to a perfect 2 hours, then I knew, okay, now we have a film.
Well, I thank you guys. Stevie Wonder is calling. So I know that we are winding down. So thank you all so much. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.